May 1940. Dawn settled gently over northern France, softening hedgerows and village roofs with a light that belonged to quieter centuries. The land appeared unchanged, almost indifferent. Yet along its narrow roads moved something unmistakably modern, German columns advancing in ordered sequence, engines humming, boots striking earth in practiced cadence. Steel, fuel, and confidence travelled together. This was war reduced to engineering. Radios stitched squads to distant command posts. Timetables replaced uncertainty. Speed itself had become doctrine. To the men moving through these villages, resistance was no longer a question, only a variable, expected to announce itself in familiar ways. Rifles would crack. Mortars would thud. Anything else lay beyond consideration. Beyond the road, where trees folded into shadow, a single British officer waited. Captain Jack Churchill lay motionless, not from fear, but from intent. He carried no rifle. No metal reflected the rising light. In his hands rested a longbow, tall, curved, and profoundly out of place. It was less a relic than a challenge to everything unfolding on the road below. Churchill watched the column pass with deliberate calm. He ignored the vehicles and clustered infantry, studying instead the structure of command as it moved. Near the centre walked a German sergeant, an experienced non-commissioned officer, the human hinge of the formation. He scanned the hedgerows because doctrine demanded it, not because he sensed danger. Doctrine had taught him what threats sounded like. The bowstring came back without a sound. No mechanical click. No flash. No warning the ear had been trained to recognize. For a fraction of a second, the morning seemed to pause. Then the arrow flew, silent, precise, and final. The sergeant collapsed as if the ground had claimed him. There was no report to answer, no direction to return fire. Voices rose, then faltered. Men searched the hedgerows with a new unease, struggling to name what had just happened. Some went prone. Others stood frozen, staring at a death that offered no explanation. Confusion spread faster than gunfire because gunfire would have made sense. In that narrow stretch of road, modern certainty fractured. War, so carefully mechanized, slipped backward in time into a space where silence could kill. And as the column hesitated beneath an empty tree line, none of them yet understood this was not chance. It was the opening moment of a lesson that would soon unsettle everything they believed about the battlefield. By 1940, German war-making had become a discipline of industry. The battlefield was no longer imagined as a contest of individual fighters, but as a system of inputs and outputs, fuel and tonnage, radio traffic and road space. Tanks were not simply weapons, they were arguments in steel. Their purpose was to move faster than an enemy could think, to collapse decisions before they could form. Doctrine reflected that belief. Victory was mapped, scheduled, and measured. The infantryman's role was to protect the machinery, to hold what armor seized, to keep the flow uninterrupted. In staff colleges and briefing rooms, war was discussed in terms of coordination, logistics, and tempo. The unpredictable human element, the eccentric choice, the old instinct, was treated as a nuisance, not a factor. In such a framework, a medieval weapon did not merely seem outdated. It seemed impossible. A longbow had no place in a manual designed for combined arms. It had no serial number, no supply chain, no column on a requisition form. It belonged to a world where men fought by sight and sound, not by frequency and grid reference. Modern armies did not fear relics. They catalogued them. The German advance reinforced that complacency. British units were withdrawing under pressure, falling back toward ports and defensive lines that grew thinner by the day. Each retreat looked, from the German perspective, like confirmation, proof that the enemy was conventional, predictable, already in motion away from decision. Resistance would come, yes, but it would come in recognizable shapes: rifle fire from a village edge, machine guns in a tree line, artillery if the British had time to emplace it. Even intelligence followed the same logic. Reports recorded what could be counted: vehicles destroyed, prisoners taken, weapons captured. Anything that did not fit the industrial profile of war rarely reached higher headquarters. Surprise was no longer expected. Only resistance, measured and answered with greater force. But certainty has a weakness: it narrows the imagination. And on a battlefield where imagination begins to fail, the smallest anomaly can become a fracture. Because somewhere along those French roads, the Germans had encountered something they could not classify, and what they could not classify, they could not fully defend against. In the days that followed, the German advance continued, but with an unfamiliar blemish, small enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to be noticed. Units moved through the same lanes and orchards, past the same hedgerows that had seemed harmless at first light. And then, at roll call, names began to go unanswered. Not privates. Not new recruits at the edge of a column. It was the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals who carried the weight of discipline and routine. Over 3 days, 7 of them vanished from the living tally. Their absence did not come with the usual soundtrack of battle. No drawn-out firefights reported by neighboring sections. No mortar registration. No sudden artillery concentrations to explain chaos. The radio logs contained no urgent calls for support, no coordinates marked in panic. There were only bodies. They were recovered quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the men who found them hoped the evidence would disappear if handled with enough care. The wounds did not match what the front had taught them to expect. There was no scattering from shrapnel, no tearing impact of high-velocity rounds. Death had arrived with a kind of restraint, direct, precise, and unnervingly silent. What disturbed the junior officers was not the number. 7 dead in the arithmetic of 1940 was not a disaster. What disturbed them was the method. Each killing seemed to happen without disturbing nearby units. Sentries heard nothing. Patrols saw no muzzle flash. Men standing a short distance away continued their work, unaware that something had just reached into the line and removed a leader. At first, the losses were treated as isolated incidents, bad luck, fog of war, perhaps a hidden sniper. But the pattern refused to dissolve. The dead were spaced in time, scattered across small movements, yet tied together by the same absence of noise, the same failure of warning. It began to feel less like random danger and more like intention. In German command culture, order was reassurance. The roll call was a ritual of control, proof that the machine remained intact. Now, each missing name introduced a pause. A glance between men. A question not spoken aloud. The shock of the first death did not fade. It hardened into unease, because whatever was doing this did not behave like the war they had prepared to fight. And somewhere behind the hedgerows, the unseen method was still at work, waiting to remove the next name. To understand why a handful of silent deaths could unsettle a modern army, you have to understand what the German command structure believed it had built by 1940. The Wehrmacht's early victories were not presented to its officers as miracles or strokes of luck. They were presented as proof that war could be made predictable if approached correctly, like a machine tuned to the right tolerances. The staff system prized efficiency. The ideal operation was one where uncertainty had been reduced to a minimum and every unit moved as if following an invisible gear. This was the promise of doctrine. Combined arms tactics, armor supported by infantry, infantry guided by artillery, artillery coordinated by radio, created an impression that battle could be solved through synchronization. The enemy's position was a problem to be mapped. The breakthrough was a problem to be timed. The pursuit was a problem to be fueled. Victory, in this view, was not romantic. It was technical. Infantry, in particular, was often treated not as the decisive instrument but as the essential support. The tank was the spear, the foot soldier protected its flanks. Artillery softened what armor could not immediately crack. Engineers bridged rivers and removed obstacles so the advance could maintain tempo. Each element had a defined purpose inside the system, and the system itself became the source of confidence. A war fought by doctrine could be repeated. It could be taught. Inside such a culture, individual eccentricity was not merely unwelcome, it was irrelevant. Officers were trained to distrust the unpredictable because unpredictability threatened coordination. A lone man acting outside the pattern was, at best, a curiosity. At worst, an inconvenience. The German mindset did not make room for the idea that a single individual using an anachronistic weapon might alter the emotional climate of a formation. The enemy was expected to resist in conventional ways, and when he did not, the deviation was assumed temporary. That assumption was reinforced every day by the geography of collapse. British units were retreating under pressure, pulling back from one line to the next, abandoning equipment, sacrificing ground to preserve manpower. From the German perspective, it was not simply retreat, it was confirmation. The British were conventional. They fought like modern soldiers when they fought at all. They were losing like modern armies often lose, by withdrawing under fire and trying to regroup somewhere else. And so superiority began to feel mathematical. German commanders measured their advantage in kilometers gained per day, in bridges seized intact, in enemy columns broken by air attack, in prisoners counted and equipment captured. When you can quantify success, you start to believe it is permanent. The mind begins to treat progress as inevitability rather than circumstance. That is how confidence changes shape. It stops being a tool and becomes a doctrine of its own. It hardens. It grows less curious. It becomes arrogance, not loud, not theatrical, but settled and institutional, woven into briefings and assumptions. The enemy is no longer studied, he is summarized. And when an army begins to summarize its enemy, it stops noticing the quiet variables, the kind that cannot be plotted on a map or entered into a report. Somewhere along those French hedgerows, the Germans were learning that their system had blind spots. Because the strange deaths were not simply casualties. They were an interruption in the logic of mechanized victory. And what threatened them most was not the arrow itself, but the possibility that the war was not as predictable as their doctrine demanded. Jack Churchill did not arrive at war by accident, and he did not carry a longbow as a joke. Long before France collapsed in the spring of 1940, his life had been shaped by a peculiar balance, discipline on one hand, romance on the other. He was a British officer in the traditional sense, trained to obey structure, but drawn to the older language of courage, the idea that a man could still matter inside vast events. He had been raised in a culture that still remembered empire and ceremony, where uniforms carried history and officers were expected to carry themselves with a certain poise. Yet Churchill's interest was never purely theatrical. He was athletic, competitive, and serious about skill. He learned weapons not as symbols, but as crafts. Before the modern war reached its full industrial stride, he had studied marksmanship and field discipline, the fundamentals of how a human being makes precision under pressure. The longbow, for him, was not nostalgia. It was competence. The English longbow had once been a national instrument, an art that required strength, patience, and repetition until the body itself became calibrated. To carry it into a mechanized war was not to pretend the centuries had not passed. It was to accept that some truths do not age out. A bow can still kill. Silence can still decide an outcome. And modern soldiers, trained to recognize danger by sound, can be made vulnerable by what they cannot hear. In a world dominated by rifles, machine guns, and artillery, Churchill understood something the manuals did not emphasize: noise is information. The crack of a shot tells you where to look. The rattle of a weapon tells you what you face. Even the scream of an incoming shell offers a brief, involuntary warning. Modern war, for all its brutality, often gave men a kind of language to interpret their threat. A bow offered no such language. Its lethality arrived without announcement. And that absence, more than the wound itself, had a psychological weight. Churchill believed fear mattered at least as much as firepower because fear changes behavior. It slows movement. It fractures initiative. It makes men obey caution instead of orders. If you could introduce fear into a formation that believed it was protected by modern certainty, you could alter its rhythm without ever matching its weapons. This was not mysticism. It was observation. Mechanized armies develop habits. Patrol routes become predictable. Sentries learn what to listen for. Doctrine creates repetition, and repetition creates blind spots. Churchill saw those blind spots as terrain, spaces where the enemy's technology and training became less useful, not more. He was, in that sense, less an eccentric than an opportunist of psychology. He did not need to outgun the Germans. He needed to unbalance them quietly, methodically, in ways that would not show up on a casualty chart but would show up in the way men began to move. And somewhere ahead, as officers laughed and staff reports failed to name what was happening, Churchill prepared to turn that silence into something sharper because the war had not yet realized the danger was not the bow, but the mind behind it. Inside a war defined by steel and statistics, the longbow looked like a prop. In British camps and makeshift briefing tents, officers were surrounded by the practical burdens of retreat, broken communications, scattered units, orders that arrived late or not at all. They spoke in the language of maps and timings, of holding lines long enough for the next withdrawal. And in that atmosphere, anything that did not contribute directly to survival was treated as indulgence. So when Churchill appeared with a bow, it invited a particular kind of reaction. Not anger. Not even disapproval. Something more dismissive, amusement. Fellow officers could tolerate eccentricity so long as it remained harmless, and to many of them the bow belonged to harmlessness. It evoked tournaments and legends, not mechanized columns. It seemed theatrical, a private gesture meant to sustain morale or identity in a war that was stripping both away. Even among allies, the assumption was the same, symbolic value, not lethality. A rifle was measured in muzzle velocity and effective range. A machine gun was measured in cyclic rate and belt capacity. A bow had none of those figures that staff officers respected. It could not be standardized. It could not be issued by the thousand. It could not be explained in a procurement memo. It was, by the logic of modern war, obsolete. The Germans, Churchill knew, would see it as more than obsolete. They would see it as absurd. To a force trained to interpret battlefield signals through sound and technology, the idea of an officer carrying a medieval weapon would seem like desperation masquerading as courage. If the bow appeared in any report at all, it would likely be filed under British eccentricity, an anecdote for laughter, not a threat for analysis. And doctrine left little space for a different interpretation. Modern armies respected psychological warfare in theory, propaganda, intimidation, massed fire, but not in the intimate, personal form of a silent weapon. The notion that fear could be introduced not by spectacle, but by precision and absence, did not fit the models. If something could not be quantified, it was rarely considered decisive. So the bow became categorized. A relic. A curiosity. A story to tell later if anyone lived long enough to tell stories. Laughter replaced analysis, because laughter is often how institutions protect themselves from uncertainty. If you can mock something, you do not have to adapt to it. Yet the battlefield does not care what men find respectable. It only responds to what works. And while the briefings continued, while officers reassured themselves that modern war had outgrown old weapons, Churchill was proving, quietly, in the hedgerows, that obsolescence is not always a matter of age. Sometimes it is a matter of imagination. The belief phase was complete, the bow had been reduced to a joke. And the danger of a joke is that it makes you look away, just long enough for the next silence to arrive. The British retreat in May 1940 was not a clean movement from one defensive line to the next. It was fracture and improvisation, units cut off from headquarters, roads clogged with refugees and abandoned equipment, orders changing as quickly as the front itself. The landscape became a maze of broken formations, where discipline existed, but only in pockets, and survival depended on how quickly a man could adapt to confusion. Yet chaos has an unusual property. It creates spaces where doctrine loosens its grip. When lines are intact, every weapon has its place and every soldier a prescribed role. But when lines break, unconventional tactics stop looking eccentric and start looking practical. The retreat did not merely force the British to withdraw, it forced them to experiment. Necessity made room for methods that peacetime training would have dismissed. Noise discipline became one of those methods. In the open stages of war, armies announced themselves constantly, engines, shouted orders, the metallic clatter of kit. But retreat sharpened the ear. A single careless sound could draw fire, reveal a position, or invite an ambush. Men learned to speak less, to move slower, to treat silence not as comfort, but as cover. Churchill understood this instinctively, and he treated the withdrawal like a laboratory. He did not fight the retreat by trying to reverse it. He fought it by studying the enemy moving through it. He watched German patrols the way a craftsman watches a process, how they entered villages, how they posted sentries, how long they lingered at road junctions. He observed habits forming in real time, shaped by confidence and repeated success. German superiority, in those early days, produced predictability. Victory had given them rhythm. Patrols moved with routine certainty, their caution dulled by the absence of serious resistance. Sentries followed patterns because patterns were efficient. They stood where doctrine said they should stand. They looked where doctrine told them to look. And they listened for the noises doctrine had trained them to expect. That predictability was the opening Churchill needed. A rifle could kill, but it also spoke. Even a single shot would echo down a hedgerow lane, alerting men hundreds of yards away, drawing attention, inviting pursuit. A bow did not announce itself. It left no report for a patrol to follow, no flash for a nervous sentry to fix upon. It thrived precisely where rifles would fail, where sound mattered more than range, and where the enemy's confidence depended on hearing danger before it arrived. Churchill moved in the seams, between retreating British elements and advancing German ones, in the half-light of orchards, along ditches and field boundaries that offered cover but demanded patience. He chose positions not for comfort, but for control, angles where a sentry could be isolated, where a patrol would pause, where a leader would drift into the open without realizing he had been selected. Innovation, in war, is rarely born from comfort. It emerges from desperation, the moment when conventional answers no longer match the problem. And in the disorder of the retreat, Churchill found a weapon that matched the moment perfectly, silent, precise, and psychologically disruptive. The Germans still believed they were chasing a retreating, conventional enemy. They did not yet realize that inside the retreat, someone was studying them and turning their confidence into a vulnerability. Churchill treated the Longo the way modern soldiers treated their rifles, as a tool that demanded preparation, not romance. Each arrow mattered. He selected them carefully, checking shafts for straightness, balancing weight in the hand, testing the fit against the string. In a mechanized war, ammunition came in crates and belts. For him, it was personal inventory, counted, recovered, reused. An arrow that could be retrieved would be retrieved because every arrow was both weapon and evidence, and he preferred to leave neither behind. Distance was not guessed. It was measured. The longbow's effectiveness depended on judgment, angle, wind, concealment, the small variations of terrain that could lift or drop a shot by inches. Churchill calculated engagement ranges with the instinct of a practiced marksman, but without the shortcuts that gunfire allowed. A rifle could correct itself by volume, 2 shots, 3 shots, a burst if needed. A bow offered no margin for improvisation. It demanded precision the first time because the second time might never come. That precision created a particular kind of threat for German sentries. They listened for rifles. They listened for the metallic cough of a submachine gun, the crack that gave direction and the echo that gave distance. They listened for the beginning of danger. But the arrow did not begin with noise. It ended with impact. It arrived as a conclusion, not a warning. So death came without the normal sequence that soldiers relied upon. There was no audible cue to duck, no moment to shout, no split second to point and return fire. A sentry would be standing at his post one heartbeat and gone the next. Men nearby would turn, not because they had heard an attack, but because they had noticed absence, an abrupt fall, a sudden stillness, a figure that should have been upright now lying wrong against the ground. Panic spread not through explosion, but through uncertainty. The Germans could handle gunfire. Gunfire could be answered with gunfire. But what do you answer when you cannot even name the weapon? Patrols were sent out to search hedgerows and ditches, to sweep orchards and farm lanes. They moved in cautious clusters, eye scanning for a muzzle flash that would never appear. They expected a sniper's nest, a hidden rifleman, something familiar enough to confront. They found nothing to engage. And in war, nothing is sometimes worse than something. An enemy you cannot locate becomes larger than he is. He expands in the mind. Fear grows disproportionate to casualties because fear is not arithmetic, it is imagination filling gaps. 7 dead sergeants did not threaten German manpower. But they threatened German confidence because each silent killing suggested a battlefield no longer governed by their rules. In that way, silence became a weapon system. Not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of explanation. It robbed the Germans of the comfort of their own doctrine, the belief that every threat could be categorized, countered, and neutralized with sufficient force. And as German patrols widened their searches, as officers demanded answers that the landscape refused to give, Churchill continued his work with the quiet patience of a man who understood that in modern war, the loudest damage is not always done by explosives. The question was no longer how many would die. The question was how many would start to hesitate, because hesitation, once introduced, spreads faster than any arrow. Within a week, the German reports began to change tone. Not in the language of catastrophe, nothing so dramatic as a routed battalion or a shattered line, but in a quieter, more revealing way. Patrol leaders wrote of unease. Sentry rosters were adjusted. Movements that had once been executed with routine speed were now described with caution. There was no single incident large enough to justify the shift. And that was precisely the problem. Officers searched for a familiar explanation. The most obvious answer was a sniper. A sniper fit doctrine. A sniper could be countered, suppressive fire, sweeping patrols, artillery on suspected positions. But the evidence resisted that neat conclusion. The dead did not show the kind of wounds German troops associated with high-velocity rounds. There was no consistent report of muzzle flash. No crack carried across the fields. Even when patrols combed the hedgerows with discipline, they found no spent cartridges, no disturbed firing positions, no trace of the usual mechanics of a rifleman at work. And so the suspicion lingered without settling. The enemy was present, yet unconfirmed. That uncertainty began to reshape behavior at the level that matters most in war, not on maps, but in the bodies of men. Morale does not collapse only under heavy casualties. It collapses when soldiers feel they cannot interpret danger. A man can tolerate fear if he believes he understands its source. He cannot tolerate it for long when the source refuses to reveal itself. The imbalance became clear, manpower remained intact, but confidence eroded. It eroded in small ways, men lingering an extra second before crossing open ground, sentries turning more often than necessary, patrols bunching up instead of spreading out. Initiative, the lifeblood of an advancing army, began to dry at the squad level. The Germans had trained their soldiers to move with purpose. Now purpose was being questioned by hesitation. Command doctrine struggled because doctrine depends on classification. An army is designed to respond to categories: artillery, armor, infantry, aircraft. Each has prescribed countermeasures. But what was the countermeasure for silence? More radios could not solve it. More tanks could not see through hedgerows. More artillery could not neutralize what could not be located. Technology, so effective at producing power, offered no solution for producing certainty. That is the hidden vulnerability of modern war. The more an army relies on systems, the more it assumes the battlefield will speak in signals those systems can read. When the battlefield refuses, when it offers effects without signatures, the entire logic begins to wobble. Not because the enemy has more firepower, but because the enemy has found a way to make your power irrelevant in a particular moment. For the Germans, the struggle became conceptual. They had to explain to themselves how men were dying without the language of modern weapons. They had to confront the possibility that an enemy could reach into their formation using methods their training did not account for. It was not the loss of 7 sergeants that mattered. It was the realization that progress had not eliminated old truths. Because the ancient truth is simple, war is not only a contest of killing power. It is a contest of perception. The side that controls what the other side believes about safety, about threat, about certainty, often controls the tempo of the fight. And somewhere in the French countryside, German commanders were beginning to sense that their greatest advantage, confidence in steel and doctrine, was being quietly turned against them. The question was no longer who was shooting. The question was what else they had failed to imagine. Recognition did not arrive with a dramatic revelation. It arrived the way uncomfortable truths often do in war, late, quietly, and through paperwork. A field report here, a medical note there, a patrol leader's description of a wound that did not fit the rifleman's signature. Somewhere behind the forward elements, an intelligence officer began to assemble the fragments into a single, unwelcome shape. At first, the conclusion seemed absurd. The German system was built to process threats in modern categories. A weapon was identified by sound, caliber, firing position, rate of fire. But these deaths had produced none of the expected markers. And when the evidence finally pointed toward something older, an arrow, a bow, the mind resisted. Not because the facts were unclear, but because they violated the assumptions that supported everything else. Disbelief, when it can no longer hold, often turns into embarrassment. The Germans were not simply being killed, they were being outmaneuvered in imagination. A medieval weapon had bypassed modern defenses, not by overpowering them, but by stepping around them. Radios could coordinate a response, but only after a threat had been recognized. Tanks could crush a hedge line, but only if they knew which hedge line mattered. The bow offered no warning and no clear direction, only results. The question in German briefings became a question of dignity as much as tactics. How do you explain to a mechanized army that its men are being removed by a weapon associated with history books? How do you instruct platoons to counter a threat that leaves no cartridges, no muzzle flash, no report? Even to speak the answer aloud felt like granting the enemy a kind of victory beyond the physical. And yet countermeasures had to be taken. More patrols were ordered, sweeps widened, sentry procedures tightened. Men were instructed to move with greater spacing, to watch hedgerows with renewed suspicion, to avoid predictable halts at road junctions. The measures were not especially complex, but they were costly in a different currency, tempo. Every additional precaution stole speed. Every widened sweep consumed manpower. Every delay at a village edge interrupted the smooth rhythm of advance that German doctrine prized. Countering a bow required an army to behave as if it were facing something much larger, because the real threat was not the arrow, it was uncertainty. So resources were diverted to chase a presence that could not be pinned down. Officers who had once spoken in confident timetables began to speak in contingencies. Momentum slowed, not because the Germans had lost their strength, but because they had lost their effortless certainty. And in that subtle slowing, the turning point arrived. Not with explosions or headlines, but with a quiet shift in posture, an army that had believed itself untouchable now moving as if it could be reached anywhere, at any moment, by something it once would have laughed at. The most revealing effects of Churchill's bow were not found in the casualty lists. They were found in the way German units began to move. In early May, the advance had been defined by tempo, patrols pushed forward on routine, junctions were taken quickly, and pauses were measured in minutes, not hours. But after the recognition, after the quiet acknowledgement that something unseen was reaching into their formations, patterns began to shift. Patrol routes changed first. Paths that had been used the day before were abandoned, not because they were tactically unsound, but because repetition now felt dangerous. Men began to avoid the clean, efficient lines of movement that doctrine preferred, choosing longer detours that offered what they believed was safety. The countryside did not change. The German perception of it did. Hedges that had once been mere terrain became potential hiding places. Orchards became questions. A road bordered by trees became a corridor of exposure. Speed, the pride of the German method, began to give way to caution. Columns halted more often. Sentries were posted in greater numbers. Patrols spent more time searching than advancing. And every extra precaution extracted a price. Not in blood, but in rhythm. A mechanized army relies on uninterrupted motion, the psychological certainty that momentum itself is a kind of protection. When momentum slows, doubt fills the space. At the squad level, initiative began to erode in subtle increments. German doctrine encouraged forward aggression, quick decisions, bold movement. But boldness requires a clear picture of risk. Now risk had become shapeless. The unseen threat could not be suppressed, could not be pinned down with fire, could not be countered by the familiar exchange of bullets. A soldier can accept incoming fire because he knows what it is and where it comes from. He cannot easily accept a death that arrives without sound, without warning, without direction. So men began to wait. They waited for better light. They waited for more support. They waited for officers to decide what they themselves had once decided instinctively. And officers, sensing the new fragility beneath them, hesitated too. Not because they doubted their training, but because training offered no neat answer to an enemy who refused to behave like a modern enemy. Fear of the unseen replaced fear of fire. Fire could be answered. Fire could be escaped. Fire could be endured. But the unseen turns every quiet field into a threat and every pause into vulnerability. It forces soldiers to imagine possibilities, and imagination can be more exhausting than combat. A man scanning hedgerows for something he cannot hear will tire faster than a man bracing against gunfire because his mind never reaches the point of certainty. The bow reshaped behavior in exactly the way Churchill had intended. Not by matching German strength, but by bending German tempo. Not by destroying units, but by altering their confidence. The Germans were still advancing, still powerful, still dangerous, but they were now advancing differently, as if the ground itself had become untrustworthy. Control did not collapse in a dramatic moment. It slipped incrementally. A few extra minutes at a crossroads. A patrol that returned early. A sentry who called out unnecessarily. A squad that clustered tighter than doctrine advised. Each small adjustment was defensible on its own. Together, they formed a new truth: the German machine no longer moved with effortless certainty. And in war, once certainty is punctured, it rarely returns intact. It spreads upward and outward, infecting assumptions, slowing decisions, and creating the opening that disciplined enemies need. The bow had not stopped the advance. It had changed its character. And as German commanders tried to restore speed without restoring confidence, the quiet question remained: how much of their momentum had been lost to something they could not even fight directly? Measured by the usual standards of war, the incident was small. 7 German non-commissioned officers, important men within their squads, but not generals, not a battalion wiped out, not a bridge blown at a decisive hour. In the arithmetic of 1940, when casualties were counted by the thousands and entire armies could be cut off in a week, it barely registered as a statistic. And yet its impact was disproportionate, because war is not governed only by numbers. It is governed by momentum, by confidence, by the invisible agreement inside an army that the world still makes sense. Churchill's arrows did not destroy German manpower. They interfered with German belief. They introduced uncertainty into a force that relied on certainty for speed. That is why this episode rarely appears in grand strategy texts. Histories of the campaign focus on the collapse of lines, the movement of panzer groups, the race to the Channel, the decisions made in headquarters far from the hedgerows. A bow does not fit easily into those narratives. It is too small, too personal, too irregular to be dignified as a factor in an industrial campaign. It becomes, at most, an anecdote, color on the margins of a larger story. But local outcomes are built from small moments. A delayed patrol. A cautious halt at a crossroads. A formation that spreads wider and moves slower. These are not the kind of changes that rewrite a map, but they do alter the texture of a fight. They can preserve lives on one side and waste time on the other. They can buy minutes that become miles. In a retreat, minutes matter. The deeper lesson was not that medieval weapons could defeat modern armies. It was that innovation does not belong exclusively to technology. A new tool is not always a new machine. Sometimes it is an old method applied where the enemy no longer expects it. Modern doctrine, for all its sophistication, can become a form of blindness when it assumes progress is linear, when it assumes the future has deleted the past. Churchill's bow did not outclass German firepower. It outflanked German imagination. It proved that adaptability outweighs doctrine when doctrine grows too confident to look beyond itself. The Germans were forced to respond with inefficiency, more caution, more sweeping patrols, more hesitation, because the threat could not be cleanly processed by their system. And the climax of this strange contest did not arrive with spectacle. No dramatic last stand. No grand duel. The moment simply resolved as war so often does, through quiet adjustments, through behavior subtly reshaped, through an enemy advancing more slowly than he expected to. The boat would soon fade back into the noise of modern conflict. But the lesson remained: in war, what is dismissed as irrelevant can become decisive if it strikes at the assumptions holding everything else together. War did not pause for this anomaly. It never does. The campaign in France grew louder and larger, expanding beyond hedgerows into the full industrial roar of 1,940 air attacks on roads choked with vehicles, artillery pounding river crossings, tanks grinding forward in columns that seemed to stretch into the horizon. The scale of events swallowed small stories quickly, and the world's attention fixed itself on larger collapses and more visible disasters. Churchill, too, moved on. The longbow had been useful in a particular moment, when silence mattered, when the terrain allowed concealment, when an enemy's confidence created predictable exposure. But as operations shifted, as engagements grew broader and more chaotic, the conditions that made the bow so potent became rarer. The war demanded other tools now: rifles, explosives, coordination with other units. Even for a man as unconventional as Churchill, there was a time to step back into the conventional machinery of fighting. So the bow was set aside, not as a failure, but as a completed task. In another war it might have become legend immediately. In this war, it was simply one method among many, used, effective, then overtaken by the next crisis. The battlefields of Europe were not short of noise, and noise has a way of burying what happens quietly. German forces resumed their mechanized advance with the same outward strength. Their armor still moved, their radios still coordinated, their commanders still spoke in timetables and objectives. The campaign's momentum remained real. No arrow could stop an army's strategic direction. Yet something had shifted internally in the men who had been closest to the episode, something that did not appear in official summaries. Certainty had been punctured. Not destroyed, not replaced by panic, but damaged in a way that could not be easily repaired. Soldiers and junior officers carried forward the memory of a threat that had arrived without sound, without warning, without an enemy they could point to. It was a small crack in the story they told themselves about modern war, that technology and doctrine had made surprise manageable, that every danger would announce itself in recognizable forms. And that is how consequence lingers beyond statistics. An army can absorb casualties and still believe in its method. But when belief is shaken, even briefly, it leaves a residue. Men become more cautious in terrain they once ignored. Officers become less dismissive of the unusual. The mind, once forced to accept the improbable, does not return completely to its previous comfort. The war, of course, continued to escalate. Bigger battles arrived, louder weapons, more decisive losses. The bow would not appear in the next communiques, and the 7 names would vanish into larger lists. But the deeper effect, the reminder that progress does not guarantee safety, remained quietly present. And as Europe moved deeper into mechanized slaughter, the question left behind by those silent deaths still hovered: if an ancient weapon could puncture modern certainty once, what else could do it again? When wars are later turned into history, they are often reduced to what can be proved on paper. Orders, movements, casualty tables, tonnage expended, bridges taken, cities lost. The archive prefers what can be counted. It prefers the language of divisions and corps, not the small, intimate disruptions that live in the nervous system of a platoon. And so the most important fractures, the ones that begin inside belief, are usually omitted, not out of dishonesty, but because they are difficult to preserve. Official histories of the 1940 campaign rarely pause for a handful of silent killings in a French hedgerow. They move, as armies moved, toward the major turning points, the crossings, the encirclements, the evacuation, the collapse of a state. Within such scale, Churchill's longbow becomes a curiosity if it appears at all a footnote attached to a colourful officer, a story told for texture rather than meaning. Innovation, too, is often remembered only when it can be scaled. New tanks, new aircraft, new radar systems, a new operational concept applied across an entire front. These are the innovations that fit the industrial imagination because they can be issued in quantities, measured in production, and credited to institutions. A single man's method, improvised in the seams of retreat, has no place in that catalogue. It cannot be mass-produced. It cannot be neatly replicated by a training syllabus. It resists standardization, and so it resists remembrance. That is how individual agency fades in archives. The personal becomes anecdotal. The irregular becomes unreliable. And yet war is not fought only by what institutions plan. It is fought by what human beings do when plans break, when fear arrives, when uncertainty interrupts doctrine, when survival requires choices that no staff manual has anticipated. Morale remains decisive precisely because it cannot be mechanized. An army can be supplied, equipped, and coordinated, and still falter if its men begin to doubt their understanding of the battlefield. Confidence is not a piece of equipment. It is a shared internal agreement between soldiers and their leaders, between doctrine and reality, that the world is readable. When that readability is damaged, even slightly, it changes behavior. It slows movement. It encourages hesitation. It turns initiative into caution. Fear cannot be mechanized because fear is not rational. It does not respond cleanly to statistics. 7 dead sergeants should not have altered an army's posture. But fear is not based on the number of dead. It is based on the feeling of exposure, on the sense that protection has failed. And exposure is magnified most by what cannot be heard or seen, by threats that deny soldiers the comfort of recognition. Silence, in that sense, resists industrialization. Industry makes noise. Machines announce themselves. Massed firepower creates spectacle. But silence arrives without spectacle, and therefore it enters the mind differently. It forces imagination to work against the soldier, filling gaps with possibilities. It makes the landscape feel watchful. It makes caution feel prudent. It turns progress itself into something questionable. This is why the lesson endures, even if the records do not measure it. The longbow was never strategically decisive. Yet it revealed something strategically important, that modern war, for all its machinery, is still fought inside the human mind. And the mind is vulnerable to methods that no factory can produce. Long after the arrow wounds had been cleaned and the reports filed away, the underlying truth remained, quietly persistent, like the hedgerows themselves. What you dismiss as obsolete can still reach you if your certainty has made you careless. Modern warfare is built on a promise. Each generation tells itself that progress has made the last one irrelevant, that new machines have replaced old instincts, that better weapons have dissolved older dangers, that what worked in the past cannot survive the present. In 1940, that promise seemed unquestionable. Armoured columns moved faster than men could march. Radios compressed distance. Air power reached beyond the horizon. The battlefield appeared to belong entirely to industry. But progress often carries a quiet assumption that superiority is linear. That history moves forward in a clean line and anything left behind stays behind. Armies train inside that assumption. They write manuals inside it. They become fluent in the threats that match their era and gradually deaf to the ones that do not. The bow contradicted all of it, not because it was stronger than steel, but because it was invisible to the logic of steel. It did not challenge German armor. It challenged German certainty. It did not destroy the machinery of advance. It disturbed the mind that drove it. A rifleman could be anticipated, countered, suppressed. A silent arrow arriving from a hedgerow offered no familiar sequence, only impact, confusion, and the unsettling realization that modern training had not prepared men for everything. Churchill's method worked because it exploited arrogance, not armor. The German system was efficient, and efficiency creates repetition. Repetition creates predictability. Predictability invites the kind of precision that does not need volume. 7 deaths were, on paper, minor. But those deaths were targeted at the human hinges of a formation, the sergeants who kept squads moving and confidence intact. Remove them quietly, and you do not merely reduce manpower. You alter behavior. That was the true consequence. German patrols widened. Columns slowed. Centaurs listened harder, not for what they could hear, but for what they could not. The bow had forced a mechanized army to move as if the landscape itself were hostile in a new way. It had introduced doubt into a doctrine that depended on certainty. And that is why the weapon was never the point. The longbow was a symbol only in retrospect. In the moment, it was a tool chosen for silence, for precision, for the psychological space it opened. Churchill understood something many modern armies forget, that war is not simply a contest of equipment. It is a contest of assumptions. Break the assumption, and even a powerful machine begins to hesitate. Years later, the story would survive because it carries a clean irony. A weapon from another century reached into the most modern campaign of its time and left an effect out of proportion to its scale. It reminded soldiers and historians alike that the past does not vanish, it waits, quietly, for arrogance to make it relevant again. They dismissed his bow as obsolete. They never dismissed it again.